whether we're talking inclusive growth, whether we're talking about human capital development, whether we're talking about infrastructure, and all of the policy directions, there's a thread that connects all of that, and sometimes there's even a base that provides the wherewithal for the government to be able to do all of this. And that's the subject of taxation. And that's why we think as part of this dialogue, it's critical that we have this conversation. So within the short minutes that's available, I'll try to provide a quick overview of how the current fiscal landscape stands as we have it in the country today. What are the changes happening? And I'll try to dwell on the most recent one, the Finance Act, and some of the other key changes that we're having within the regulatory space. And what are the action items for everyone? So whether you represent the private sector or you are in the public sector, there's some action point in terms of where we are and where we need to go, and we'll try to close it all with some concluding thoughts. So I think an appropriate place to start when it comes to discussing the current state of things is to recognize the critical need of mobilizing a lot more revenue to execute all of our projects. We may have different perspective as to, the use and application of current funds that is available to government. We may have differences in terms of what we consider as priorities in terms of areas of focus. We may have concerns as to whether the split between recurrent and capital, whether it's appropriate. But one area that I think there should be an alignment for us to actually have a valid conversation is recognizing the fact that the country needs to upscale the amount of revenue that is available to it. And there are statistics that speaks to this very clearly. Whether you look at it from the tax penetration in the country and you compare it to our peers, you compare it to the economies that are far advanced, or you compare it to even economies that sometimes we claim to be doing better than. Nigeria sits within a mix that shows a significant gap at 7% tax to GDP ratio, below that. Africa's average is above 17%. Africa's tax to GDP ratio in terms of average. OECD is above 34%. So there's something about the level of tax penetration and the non-oil tax revenue that we can make. Now that should be a fact that we should all ascribe to. I think where we would differ is around why is this so? And depending on what side of the table you sit, if you sit on the side of government, you will talk about the general culture, non-willingness of Nigerians to be compliant, the fact that a number of people will try to find means and ways, of paying the least possible. And the list can go on. If you sit on the side of a private sector, you would discuss challenges around doing business in Nigeria, paying taxes, and a whole lot of things that encourages voluntary compliance. And look at the budget numbers, some of the statistics that is shown above. Look at the trend of revenue. The top one shows the revenue. As for 2020 budget, we're expecting to generate maybe a little over 8 trillion naira. For an economy of our size, 8 trillion naira, assuming all assumptions met, all targets met, our historical performance has never shown that we usually hit that target. Capital outlay plan around 10.6 trillion. Look at the quantum, the mix between, capital and debt servicing. The blue one right on top at 2.5 is capital expenditure. Debt servicing is 2.7 trillion. All right? Recurrent non-debt 4.8 trillion. Of course, there is a different conversation that this shows in terms of the appropriateness of the mix. But what it also shows is that within the current structure that is available, within the provisions that the executive have to comply in terms of running the bureaucracies of government and making sure that we meet some of the constitutional requirements in terms of the size of cabinet or the number of people we'll appoint, there's a lot of tough issues, within there that are difficult to resolve. We've got to be able to make tough choices. But alluding to the assertions by the private sector in terms of the connection between how much of revenue we're able to make and the ease of doing business, the graphs, maybe the top bottom, kind of speak to that. We must recognize the fact that as much as Nigeria is making very commendable progress towards making doing business easy, the place where we sit is still not yet very close at all to destination, right? We've moved in terms of ease of doing business because of some of the initiatives being run by PEBEC, the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council, and a number of the government policies. We've moved from 170 that we were in 2015, for example, down to 131 by the last rating, that represents for 2020. Good as that shows in terms of progression, but 131 is where we are out of a 190, nations that are covered. So there's still a long road ahead. In terms of paying taxes, out of the same 190, we've moved from 182 years back, very few years back, we're sitting in the bottom 9 out of the 190. Now we've moved progressively, we're now below 160, we're now 159, but it is not yet the destination. And there is a link between what the environment shows and how much of revenue. And that's why you see the FRS tax revenue. The highest we've had so far is the 2018, where FRS was able to generate about 5 trillion, 5.3 trillion. The closest to it was 2012, when we made about 5 trillion. My estimate is that the 2019 number, when they're out, won't be up to 2018, maybe something between 5 trillion or a little above, because we have the release as at end of Q3, which is more or less very close to what we had in 2018. And the last quarter of the year is not when you make a lot of revenue. So best case, maybe we move as close as possible to 5.3 trillion. The gap is still far. 2020 projection is something within the range of 8 trillion.